Good morning. This is Ed Cressley, the chair of the Financial Aid Advisory Committee. I want to welcome you to the March 4th meeting and hope that this will be a meeting that will provide helpful information and good conversation as we continue to see how we can best serve our students within the state of Texas with the financial aid resources that we can provide. Want to begin with just a few meeting guidelines, and this information you should see on the slides, but just a reminder that this meeting is live on YouTube. So take that into consideration as we continue throughout the meeting. Also remember when you're not speaking to mute your microphone to minimize any background noise and to allow all involved to hear that person who is speaking. We will need to establish a quorum. We'll do that by roll call in just a few minutes. Any motions that we might have will be by voice vote. And if the motion is not clear, then we would take a person by person vote. When speaking, make sure that each person identifies themselves prior to speaking, just so that we have that information on the record. Please wait for the person speaking to complete their statements before other people making comments, just to avoid, again, any muddled or unclear communication. Remember that you can use the raise your hand feature at the top of your video feed. That will allow us to recognize individuals to speak. The handouts that have been distributed will not necessarily appear in the video conference, but you have those and they will also be available after this meeting. We will plan to take a 10-minute break around 11 o'clock, and hopefully we'll be concluding this meeting prior to 1 o'clock today. So let me begin now with establishing a quorum for this committee meeting. So as I call your name, if you'll just acknowledge your presence, and we'll then be able to proceed with the meeting once we've established a quorum. So first, Anish Welch.
Here.
Robert Marino.
Here.
Charles Conteros Pultz.
Here.
Dr. Ben Bohlin.
Here.
Joanna Boley.
Here.
Victoria Chen.
Here.
Paul Galean actually received notice just prior to this meeting that he will need to drop out from this committee, so he will not be present in this meeting or in future meetings. Rochelle Garnett.
Here.
Didi Gonzalez.
Here.
Heidi Granger.
Here.
Bridget Ingram.
Here.
Tam Gwynn.
Here.
Holly Nolan.
Here.
Shauna Norton.
Here.
Stephen Peterson.
Here.
Thomas Ratcliffe.
It doesn't appear that he's joined yet.
Okay. Kelly Steelman.
Here.
Dr. Joy Thomas.
Here.
Dr. Foreman Thompson, we received notice that he will be joining us after 10 o'clock. Arnold Trejo.
Here.
And then Jace Kalia.
Here.
Okay. So it does appear that we have a quorum, and we can proceed with the meeting. So the first item on our agenda for the morning is to approve the minutes from the December 10th meeting. These minutes were distributed prior to the meeting with opportunity for you to review, just asking if there are any corrections or clarifications before approving these minutes. Okay, if there are no corrections, then the minutes are approved as distributed. Agenda item 3 is an update of prior Financial Aid Advisory Committee business. Dr. Conteros-Poltz. Looks like you may need to unmute.
In a way, I just said the greatest speech you'd ever heard, but no one heard it. So one housekeeping item that I wanted to mention before I go into the prior business is just a reminder that chat messages are not visible to the public during this meeting. And since this is an open meeting, chat messages should not be your way of participating in the meeting. So if you have information to share, please share that verbally as opposed to via chat. The one prior business item, as I reviewed previous agendas, was an item related to the work study program. At our last meeting, I indicated the agency's intent to propose amendments to the timely distribution of funds rule that would have aligned the timely distribution of work study funds with the other state grant programs. And pursuing that approach was predicated on the agency being able to implement a work study funding request process that mimicked the grant funding request process. And that grant funding request process is just 2 fields that you have to fill out in an online form. Due to some changes in resource availability at the agency, we won't be able to implement the revised request process by this summer. And so I want to stay true to our word that we would only propose the amendments if we had a mechanism to reduce the burden on institutions for requesting the funding. And since we can't do that at this time, we're not going to propose those amendments at this time. We will wait and we'll propose those amendments in the future once we've been able to implement the simpler process for requesting work study funds. Any questions about that? Okay, thank you very much. That was the only prior business item.
Okay, thank you. We will be altering the agenda items and move to agenda item 9 at this time. And this is the College District Insights and Recommendations. And Ben Bolin, share whatever you would like to share with the committee at this time.
All right, thank you, Ian. Just a few updates from last time, just similar process, just districts, just not only ours, but around here are just really scrambling to work on recovering credits for students right now, focusing a lot on seniors and coming up with some alternate plans to recover those credits. I'd mentioned before that our district had worked on our Canvas is our learning format that we use, and a lot of the campuses have created the financial aid process detailed through that, and they found some success with that here lately, and so that's a good sign. working with students through that. I've kind of gone through some of those programs that they've put out there through the process, and it's been really actually something good. So silver lining is going forward, I think it's something they'll have in place, created to use for students that will help make the process simpler and more straightforward. But they're finding a lot, the counselors are talking with a lot of students that are just more and more unsure about pursuing higher education past graduation, and feeling that with the financial burden on families that they're really having to, maybe they're doing the time off approach and continuing to work, in which we all know a lot of times that doesn't turn out really well, and students never continue to pursue higher education. So still working with that process, and a big focus still right now, and recovering credits so they're able to continue on and pursue the higher education process afterwards.
Okay. Any questions for Ben, or comments regarding high schools and high school students as they continue to consider their options of pursuing post-secondary education?
This is Taryn. I have a quick question. Ben, I was wondering, are there specific cohorts of students that y'all are noticing are more significantly impacted or are feeling the crunch? I mean, I would assume that certain areas or certain groups of students are the ones that are maybe considering holding off on college. So just wondering if you can give some insight into the dynamics or demographics of those families most impacted.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of our students from the lower income families. A lot of the issues that we're seeing now, even with our ninth grade students, is that they're taking the role of staying at home to do virtual learning. Well, it's coded virtual learning, but they're not really participating a lot. And the reason is they're taking care of younger siblings. We find that a high percentage of the time when we talk to them, and doing a lot of things, going to homes to visit students and talk to them about what's going on and those types of things. And that's what you're finding a lot of times is they're in that situation where they're preparing the meals and taking care of younger siblings. So it's definitely our population that's qualified for the free or reduced lunch. And so, a lot of the older students too are going into work during when they'd normally be at school. And so we talked to them, and they're like, well, I had to go into work from 9 to 2 or something like that. Oh, I'll get the work done later on this evening, and they don't. So it's definitely our population that's at most need that we're finding those numbers. And some of our campuses have a higher majority of those students, and they've got hundreds of students that are not attending courses, and they're trying to recover those. And so that's been pretty consistent as far as the population. And I don't know if Shauna is finding anything different on her side in her district.
No, this is Shauna Norton. I will say that we're seeing a lot of the same things. Our district, actually, we were having a lot of failures with our remote students who were supposed to be participating online but may or may not have been. And so we actually made students return if they were failing, or they had to choose another option, but they couldn't stay remote. And so from that, we did get some students back. And now, we're just working on trying to get them back on track as far as their courses and grades are concerned. But we did end up losing some students to their parents withdrawing them to homeschool so that they didn't have to return to school, and they were failing. And we're assuming that most of those kids are not actually doing homeschool. And most of them will probably try to come re-enroll next year, and then we'll be behind on even more credits. So. Oh, and I will add, we do have, this year we are struggling to get students to fill out Fafsa. And so I know that our counselors and administrators on campuses are just extremely concerned about next year when it is a graduation requirement. I noticed I didn't look at the new agenda item that was sent out until this morning, and I did notice there was a FAFSA graduation requirement modification on there, so I'm interested in getting more information about that.
Any other questions, comments? Okay, let's move on to agenda item 4, and this is a joint update regarding House Bill 3, which is the FAFSA graduation requirement and also the TASFA subcommittee. So we've got Claudette Jenkins, Director of College Access, and Robert Marino, our subcommittee chair.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm just going to provide some very quick updates on House Bill 3. I have a point of contact, Alexis Bowserman, who would be the point of contact for Texas Education Agency's House Bill 3 FAFSA high school graduation requirement. However, I do have a few updates I can share with you. TEA has established a financial aid graduation requirement webpage under the, and it should be going live any day now. It's accessible through TEA's new Counseling, Advising, and Student Supports, or CAS website. So if you go to their website, you can just type in Counseling, Advising, and Student Supports, and they have a website. I can also share that link with you, with Chad, to send to your way. TEA's advisory committee had developed and submitted recommendations to assist the agency in adopting those rules to implement that new requirement to the legislature in a similar timeline that we submitted our TASFA report. So that was submitted by January 1. Those recommendations included the establishment of a timeline for distribution to students of the FAFSA and TASFA applications, and the form for students to decline to complete a financial aid application. It also included a requiring each school district to report to the agency the number of students who completed and submitted the financial aid application and those that received an exemption. It included ensuring compliance with federal laws regarding confidentiality of student information, and the committee also provided feedback on the opt-out form that was to be used for students to be exempt from that requirement, as well as the data plan, implementation resources, and proposed rules. The opt-out form will be posted on TEA's CAS website as soon as it's available. You can preview it, though, by looking at TEA's legislative report that was submitted in January. The opt-out form is included as an appendix in that report. It's currently being translated to Spanish, and both versions will be available on the CAS webpage once it's available. TEA has also established a contract with Texas OnCourse, and I don't know if you all know, but Texas OnCourse has moved to the coordinating board, so now it's housed at the staff is now housed at the coordinating board. So they've essentially established a contract with our agency to begin producing stakeholder toolkits on a single financial aid hub on the OnCourse website, and that should be available this summer. So the eTASFA updates. Final eTASFA recommendations, like I mentioned, were submitted to the legislature by January 1. Funding for the eTASFA is still being determined. However, we're working very closely with Texas Education Agency to secure funds for the initial development. We're already in that process, so we should be receiving those, between now and for the development between now and August of this year. So we are also working to identify internal and other external funding streams. As I shared in previous updates at this committee, the Texas Application for State Financial Aid Advisory Committee, the separate eTASFA committee that was meeting or convened, heard from other states that had their own state financial aid application. In that research and work, we met with the California Student Aid Commission, and that California Student Aid Commission had or developed a state application for financial aid that was most similar to the current FAFSA application, mainly in its look and feel and some of the questions that were available. So we saw that as an opportunity to work with them to create a similar application, and they have been willing to work with us in creating that application that's similar to the FAFSA. And that's what a lot of our stakeholders wanted, as well as the committee members and different groups that we heard from during that time that we convened. So we're working with California to get an MOU in place. We should have it available as early as this month to get to have them help us in that partnership of developing a similar application. Considering the future changes coming with the Fafsa Simplification Bill, a request for extension to have the e-TASFA available was sent to the legislature. So delaying the e-TASFA requirement to align with the implementation of this new FAFSA coming up would avoid significant work that would be completed within a year. So that was what we are recommending. Should the agency receive an extension of time to create or make available this application, it's expected that the online application would be available October 1 of 2022 for the 22-24 school year. However, just know that development is continually moving. We're still seeking guidance on that extension of time. The coordinating board is also working on a few other areas in development that were not discussed during the other convening of the committee, and this included understanding of how what it means to actually integrate or house the e-TASFA in the Apply Texas system. So we're still working out some of those details and how it could really truly be integrated, what it means to be integrated into Apply Texas. And we're also talking about other areas like the considerations of institutions and the Institution of Higher Education's renewal process. Those things did not get discussed during the committee's, the TASFAC committee's group work. So we're now circling back and asking for some feedback on those areas to really inform how the application will work. We did meet with the yesterday with the this committee's TASFA subcommittee to provide an update and discuss the renewal process and different other things like transmission of data. So as you know, the Texas application for Student Financial Aid Advisory Committee was established through House Bill 2140 to determine those initial recommendations to the legislature on the development of the electronic TASFA. That task has now been completed. However, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this development of the TASFA. So what we're asking is hopefully we would like to request that additional members be added to this current Financial Aid Advisory TASFA subcommittee to expand feedback opportunities. So we're looking to this group to hopefully add some others that may have come from the other advisory committee group and just kind of join both committees. So that is all the updates I have, and I'm open for questions.
Ed, I think one of the key things based on what Claudette mentioned was for the FAC to discuss whether or not her proposal of having the TASFA subcommittee expanded is something that this committee agrees with and approves.
Robert, you chair that committee. Any thoughts? Please, for members that you'd like to suggest?
Yes, Ed, and actually it was going to be part of my report. I was going to ask, to support Claudette's request that we expand our subcommittee with need representation, particularly from private schools. Thomas, Victoria, if you can volunteer some of your employees, that would be great. We do need to expand it to include more representation from the Rio Grande Valley because my understanding is they use the TASFA, current paper TASFA substantially, so that could provide us substantial feedback.
Yeah, certainly. I think with this committee, it doesn't necessarily require that you're part of the Financial Aid Advisory Committee. It can be other individuals within the state. So as Robert has said, if you're aware of or you might want to suggest, nominate others to be a part of that. Thinking also, Taryn, with our association, maybe getting word out through the association of an opportunity to serve, I think is important. Robert, did you have more in your update of the subcommittee before, unless there are other questions for Claudette, or we can address those, after your report?
Let me go ahead and I only have a couple items, and then we can, request feedback from everyone. As Claudette mentioned, we met on Tuesday, the 2nd. Basically, the subcommittee concluded that we do not have any recommendations at this point. The changes we made for this current year, open in the fall, were well received. Right now, we're basically just waiting for the draft or the next year's FAFSA to come out so that we can see if there's any modifications we need to make to the current paper FAFSA. Also, we're in a waiting state to see what's going to happen with the Fafsa Simplification to see if we need to make current changes. And other than that, our next meeting will be May 4th for the current subcommittee. Unless we join efforts with Claudette's subcommittee, then we'll be meeting more often.
Hey, go ahead.
Sorry. I just need to ask a quick clarification on what Robert just mentioned. Robert, you just said that you're going to meet May 4th unless you join up with the other group. So I'm confused. Are we joining the two groups or aren't we?
Well, and that's what Claudette, I think you were asking for. Your request was to add additional members to our subcommittee, but I think we're also going to push forward to join efforts on both subcommittees. So,
well, just to clarify, so the task of the TASFAC committee has completed. So what we're asking is to join this committee, whether it's new members or we could also reach out to the members of our TASFA advisory committee to join this subcommittee because there were a lot of those that were very active. So we could do that as well. That's what I was suggesting, is to join this committee. Does that help?
So just for clarification, Claudette, it's not really that you're trying to join this committee. You're just asking, can we expand our TASFA subcommittee to have greater representation to assist you?
Yes, to assist in the TASFA scope of work, which is not, because currently this subcommittee, your subcommittee that Robert oversees, works on the paper form. We're asking for inclusion of the electronic form.
Is everyone on the committee, on the FAC committee, comfortable with expanding the TASFA subcommittee to include both the paper and the electronic TASFA? Please verbally state your thoughts.
We've got, I think, one hand raised here. Let's take that, and then if we do need a formal approval or motion, we can do that. But let's maybe take this comment first.
Hi, thank you. This is Heidi Granger with the University of Texas at El Paso. Claudette, I have a question for you. I know you said that you requested the extension of the year so that it coincides with the simplification of the FAFSA, but I didn't hear you if you had a tentative date for a response from them.
We do not. Our external relations. I helped create a piece of the memo that went forward to the legislature. We might have someone on, I think John Wyatt might be able to help answer that question, but no, I don't have that information currently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, just one comment or thought about this idea of if the eTASFA is delayed in implementation, what challenges that might create for high schools with the graduation requirement, with, I think, the thought, if this was part of the Apply Texas, there would be a way that schools would know whether the student has completed the form or not, whereas without that, it sounds like it would be a student by student manual basis of confirming that requirement, and just what issues that might create with this requirement for graduation.
Yeah, we're working closely, our agency is working closely with TEA to discuss data and accountability for that purpose. They are still interested in funding this development because they're looking towards the future of capturing that information. So I don't know if you're familiar, but the Apply Texas system has a counselor suite that does have currently Fafsa data that's received from the U.S. Department of Education through our agency's Fafsa Completion Initiative. We are looking at creating something similar for the TASFA, to have similar components for the TASFA. So that will be in development. Right now, it's the school districts don't have to say how they've received the data, only that it is there. So it does create some additional processes, but for the future, and we've had this discussion before, for future, it would be beneficial to have the establishment of the ETASFA. And they're still also thinking about that opt-out form. We don't even know what that's going to look like for, as an option if students are counted, because a student could opt out themselves if they're 18. A counselor can opt out for a good reason, and that reason does not have to be provided. And the parent or guardian can also opt the student out. So we don't know what that looks like with the option of an opt-out form either, which is not tracked either. It's still something that the school districts will have to report to TEA.
So just for clarification, Chad, do we need a motion to expand the committee? And if so, Robert, can you offer that motion?
I don't know that we need a motion. I just think that it needs to be, we just need to make sure that everyone understands what we're about to do with the subcommittee. So I've seen some people nod their heads. That's all I know as to whether or not anyone agrees or disagrees with this idea.
Sure. Okay.
Denise has her hand up.
Right.
I agree with the idea. I think that we need to continue to work on this project, and whether it's electronic or paper, I think it's very important that we support what they're doing. And because it's the TASFA as a whole, I think that it would be very good for us to go ahead and continue that support for both paper and electronic. And that way, hopefully seamlessly, we can move to the electronic platform.
Any other comments, either of support or maybe questioning the idea of kind of the expansion of and the scope of work of our TASFA subcommittee?
Ed, this is Arnold Trejo. I agree with Denise. I think we ought to expand the committee to have cross-representation in such a very important process that we need to look at in the future.
Okay, with that, unless there are other comments, I think certainly do also agree with the idea that this is an important, I think, area for this committee and, for the state, as this is something that is state-driven, and that providing a way for students who are eligible to receive state aid to be able to apply, I think is clearly a priority. So, Robert, whatever you need from us and however we can build up this committee. And then I think it does sound like a heavier lift for the committee with meetings and things, how we can support. But do look forward to, in the next meeting, kind of an update on the progress of, I think, a number of things that are still in the works with the status of when we'll have an e-form ready, and as well as the issues that are there for not only new students who are coming out of high school, but for our current students to have access to a form and be able to apply.
Absolutely. Yes. So the immediate support that we'll need is more members. So if you know somebody that would be willing to volunteer, even if you're not using the current paper TESFA, my understanding that there is a proposal that it is a line item to make it mandatory for all schools to accept the e-TESFA. So eventually we may all end up using it.
Robert, this is Rochelle. How many members total do you have right now?
We had 6, but it has, over the year has come down to, we only have 5. Well, actually we have 7. We only have 5 now. Yeah.
Okay. So. And the issue is you need more representation at the private school level.
Private and also
South Texas area.
South Texas area as well. Thank you.
Robert, this is Victoria from TCU. We would be happy to assist with the private school aspect.
Thank you.
I see Claudette, your hand.
Yes, I was just going to piggyback on what Robert mentioned. If you want to send us or make recommendations on who those individuals you want to include, you can send an email to Leah Smalley, Robert, or myself, just to let us know. We also need that school district group support. The TASFA advisory committee did have counselors in nonprofit organizations that were also involved in that group, so we can again solicit some feedback from them as well.
Okay, unless there are further comments, questions, we'll move on to agenda item 5.
Ed, before we move on to agenda item 5, I just want to mention that Thomas Ratliff has been able to join the meeting so that we have that for the record.
Okay, welcome, Thomas.
Thank you. It's great to finally be in. Technical morning.
All right, agenda item 5 is an external relations update from the coordinating board, Senior Director of External Relations, John Wyatt.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? First thing I always have to check on all of these meetings. Well, good morning. Appreciate y'all the invitation to give y'all a bit of an update on where things stand with the legislative session. I think the last time we talked was in December, and quite a bit has obviously changed since then. In fact, we are now 2/5 of the way through the legislative session. So in terms of where we stand, pretty much the organizational part of the session is done. As you know, the House elected a new speaker, Representative Dade Phelan, and committees have been appointed in both the Senate and the House. In the Senate, the Senate Higher Education Chair continues to be Brandon Creighton. In the House, we have a new chair of higher education, that's Representative Jim Murphy. So those committees have all, I think except for Senate Higher Education, most of the committees have had at least initial organizational meetings to get started. So in terms of the work of the legislature so far, the focus has really been on the budget. So the Senate Finance Committee and the House Appropriations Committee have been having meetings over the last 2 to 3 weeks to begin the work of crafting the state budget for the next biennium. Commissioner Keller has testified in both Senate Finance and House Appropriations over the last couple of weeks. regarding the coordinating board's budget, but also the larger issue of the importance of investing adequately in higher education, and really trying to drive home the point that, yes, this is a difficult budget session, but higher education really is going to be kind of the tip of the spear for leading us out of the economic situation that we're in, and really kind of driving the recovery and making sure that we have a quick and sustainable recovery out of our economic difficulties. So the commissioner has, as I said, testified before both budget writing committees. As you may know, so the General Appropriations Acts have been introduced in both chambers. Both of those introduced bills include a 5% reduction to the major financial aid programs at the coordinating board. As you know, every agency was instructed to prepare a 5% reduction to their budget for their proposal for the coming biennium. And that 5% reduction was included in the introduced bill. That does not mean that is where that number is going to end up. That is just the starting point for the legislature to have a conversation about, based on the fiscal circumstances of the state, where we want to invest limited funding. But the commissioner has been very clear about the importance of investing in financial aid, both in terms of making sure that students across Texas, students of all means, students of all ethnicities and backgrounds are able to attend and be successful in higher education. And so as part of our legislative appropriations request, our budget proposal for the next biennium, we have two exceptional items that are relevant to financial aid. First off, we recommended the restoration of that 5% base cut. So it was about $57 million across the three major financial aid programs that we are requesting respectfully that the legislature restore that funding back to the level that it was appropriated at for the current biennium. So a level funding scenario, if you will. We also have an exceptional item request for, on top of that, an additional $110 million. And that is the amount of funding that we anticipate would be needed next biennium to maintain the service level for those programs. So continuing to serve the same percentage of initially eligible students through our major financial aid programs. So we have requested, again, respectfully of the legislature, that they make that additional investment to not just keep us at level funding, but to keep us at least at a level service level as the current biennium. So I can tell you in the initial hearings and the commissioner's testimony, there's a lot of concern in the legislature about reducing financial aid, about the impact that will have on our students and our families and our institutions. So I do anticipate there's going to be a lot of interest in trying to find a way to dedicate additional resources to making sure that students of all means are able to participate in higher education. So that's kind of where we stand right now in the budget aspect of it. In terms of the more policy aspect of things, so the House Higher Education Committee is actually having its first meeting right now, and the commissioner was testifying earlier this morning. So they're having their organizational meeting. Senate Higher Education has not met yet. We do anticipate that they will have their first meeting before the end of the month. And those are the committees that are going to hear any higher education legislation that's filed and comes up. I think Chad has shared with y'all a list of kind of the major higher ed bills that have been filed so far. Yeah, I mean, obviously, y'all might have your own perspective. I don't think there's anything terribly surprising on that list. I don't think that there's anything that That's particularly unanticipated. As you've seen, we have some promise grant programs proposals that have been filed. We're seeing some new exemption bills that are being filed. So nothing really that you look at that and you say, this is a surprising filing. Now there's still time. So the deadline for members to file bills is next Friday. And honestly, even after the bill filing deadline, there are still ways in the process to introduce amendments, introduce committee substitutes. So even after the filing deadline, that doesn't mean that what's been filed is the universe of what's going to be considered by the legislature. So just putting that warning in front of you. So what is going to advance during this session? That is very difficult to say. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that this session has been unlike any other, certainly that I can recall. Even before this session started, we knew that the legislature was going to have to address a budget deficit. They were going to have to address coronavirus impacts. We knew that this was going to be a redistricting year. That's always a huge issue for the legislature. And we knew that they were going to have to do that in an environment where health and safety protocols would really limit their ability to maintain the same kind of workflow that they have in past sessions. So we knew all that. And then the power grid shut down for a week. So that threw another item on the agenda that is going to take up a lot of the oxygen. So, what does that mean for higher education? Well, I think there was some talk after last session about that being a pub ed session. And maybe this next session could really be a higher ed session where we could focus on, kind of building on that work through HB3. We're not going to see that. The legislature has, a very understandable shift in priorities in terms of what they really have to focus on. Now, that being said, I mean, it's there will still be opportunities to advance higher ed policy. Certainly higher ed will be addressed in the budget, but I wouldn't think that this is going to be the kind of session where you're seeing kind of major groundbreaking higher ed legislation really being advanced. So, I don't know the specifics of what might actually end up moving, but I think everyone needs to have realistic expectations about what's going to happen this session. And then I'll also mention the electronic TASPA was brought up. So we have had communications with legislative offices regarding the misalignment between the Fafsa Simplification Act implementation and the requirement for the electronic TASPA, so that they're aware of the problems that causes, the potential for doing all this work and just having to redo it in a year. We've also brought to their attention the other misalignments created through the Fafsa Simplification Act, and so we've brought that issue and the impact to their attention. And really, it's kind of up to them in terms of how they want to advance fixes on those issues. So we will continue to have those conversations with legislative offices, continue to make sure they understand those impacts, and really kind of act as a resource for them and a support for them, so they can have the information they need to make informed decisions. So that's kind of my initial spiel, but I always get more out of the Q&A than I do just listening to myself talk. So I'd be happy to answer any questions or entertain any conversation regarding the session.
Questions for John?
I have a comment or question. This is Taryn, TASFA president from University of Dallas. So on the TASFA recommendations that are coming up later on the agenda, FAFSA simplification, simplified FAFSA alignment is a big topic amongst the TASFA board and TASFA members, and a big concern. And most of that is due to timing, that if those things don't get done this cycle, this session, the timing of it may not work out for, I mean, if it's considered in the next session, we'll already be in that FAFSA, and it would be essentially too late to make those changes in a reasonable time for us to educate students on them. So what I'm curious is, what could TASFA be doing to assist with those efforts, if anything? Can our members, can our schools do anything to help bring that to the forefront?
It's a good question. So I would say on this, the same thing I would say on any policy priority for your institutions. The coordinating board, we are having our conversations. You need to work through your institution to make sure that your leadership is aware of this issue. Every institution has governmental relations staff who work very closely with the legislature. So just going through, kind of your appropriate channels of communication with it in your institution to make sure that your folks are aware that this is an issue. It's always handy for legislators to be hearing from more than one entity. So the coordinating board, we can have our conversations, but if legislators are hearing the same thing from several, from institutions, from other stakeholders, it's going to obviously have more weight.
John, this is Arnold Trejo. I have a question for you. You mentioned that it would take $57 million to restore the 5% cut, and then that it would take $110 million additional funding to fund at level service. And first of all, I like your figures. Okay, so there's no argument there. But how did we determine the 110? Was there considerations taken from the standpoint that we in the financial aid community are going to get hit hard with a lot of loss of income due to the pandemic, professional judgment cases, and those kinds of things? Was any consideration or any predictors out there that we're going to have more lower income families coming to us for affordability?
And I think I'm actually going to have to defer to Chad on that question, since it was his team who did the math to give us those numbers. So Chad, I'm throwing you under the bus.
That's fine. One of the pieces about this is to clarify that based on the legislative cycle, those numbers that were developed were actually developed last summer in putting pieces together. So those numbers did include growth factors for the programs, but I'll acknowledge that at the time we didn't have any solid numbers that we could feed in as to, what is the unusual growth due to the pandemic and the like. So they did include growth, but whether it included enough growth, I'm not sure.
And one thing we always emphasize with the information we provide to the legislature is these are estimates. One of the challenges you have with saying, this amount of funding is going to serve, such percentage of students is that's from now, it's like 3 years out that, those students are actually going to be served. And if the last year has shown anything, it's that circumstances can intervene to make your estimates not particularly valid anymore.
Thank you.
Other questions? John, I have just maybe a little insight that you could provide with the COVID-19 relief funds that are being received from the federal government. There's the CARISA Act that is now in effect, and those dollars are flowing to universities, but also flowing to states. And it would appear, there's future legislation where there will be more dollars that will be flowing, some dollars directly to universities and others to the state. But is there any insight as to those funds that are coming to the state, how they might flow down to universities and to student aid, like those GEAR funds that we, in a sense, have administered, but still in the process of working with?
Yeah. So we're up to our fourth or fifth stimulus bill, I think. In terms of those federal funds, there's the money that's going, in terms of what's already been passed, the money that's going directly to the institutions has gone out. The GEAR funds, there was a round of GEAR funds in the CARES Act. And that, as you may know, I think about 175 million of that went to the coordinating board, which we used to, in part, support the financial aid programs during the current fiscal biennium, so that they would not have a reduction in funds to, as you're well aware, make those emergency aid awards. So that was done through the CARES Act GEAR funding. There was additional GEAR funding that was provided under the, what are we calling it now, the CRRSA, the CRRSAA Act. They really needed a better acronym for that. That have gone to the governor's office, and ultimately it's kind of the governor's and leadership's decision about how the funds are going to be employed to support both primary, secondary, and higher education. So, I don't have any particular information on where things stand with decisions around those funds. And then, we still have the situation in Washington where, it looks like another, major federal stimulus act is probably on the way. And, I don't know offhand, what's going to be included in that. It got through the House, but the Senate's a 50-50 Senate. So there may be some changes happening to that before all is said and done. But, really all we can do is kind of hope for the best and then just, make sure that when those funds do come down to us, that we're good stewards.
And Ed, I'll just add that in relation to the initial GEAR funds that we received, we did put some information in the meeting handouts that provide some detail of kind of how the EEG, the Emergency Educational Grants, what their impact was, some demographic information and things on the recipients. And there's also a handout that External Relations put together regarding the whole $175,000 and how that's going towards the financial aid programs, the reskilling and upskilling, online learning support, etc. So there's some additional detail in there for everyone to have.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if there are more funds that become available to the coordinating board and then available to schools, certainly I don't think anyone would not be interested in receiving those funds. I think the only thing that I wonder about is any opportunity to influence how those funds would be administered. And I guess my initial thought is continuing a similar process as to what we have done before versus creating a new process would be, I think, highly beneficial to universities. I mean, my observation with what we're doing, again, with the additional funds that are coming directly to schools, I mean, at my institution, we're following kind of the same playbook that we did for CARES Act funds, and that's making it a whole lot easier for the university to do this and not creating something new, even though there are, some variations on student eligibility and all of that. But would, at least my sense is, if funds were to become available through the coordinating board to schools, any opportunity to provide insight as to how best those funds could be utilized, and maybe even some conversation if that would provide some insights moving, in ability of the coordinating board to influence, what the governor might do, as to, do we feel like how these funds were targeted and administered, that that seemed to be, along with the information you have, but from our perspective, that it really helped students, and we're helping the right students. So would open that up for any comments from other members.
Ed, just from an administrative standpoint, for the GEAR funds, particularly the emergency educational grant, one of the things we did do was made sure to really track all the feedback we received from institutions throughout the program. We were in touch with institutions, actually more so than probably any grant program. We gave every institution a phone call to check to make sure that they were on track to spend emergency educational grants, and reaching out via email, etc. So we definitely assembled kind of a lessons learned document from all the feedback that we received, such that if we were recipients of additional funding to be used towards that the same concept again, if anything, is there a way that we could simplify the process moving forward? So
from that, I hear it sounds like you feel like you've gotten good feedback, and if given opportunity to influence how those funds would be charged to the coordinating board to utilize, you have insights that would be helpful. So that's good to know. Are there any questions, comments about, first of all, reference some of the handout materials regarding these funds, also handout with the different proposed legislation, but any other questions that you might have for John? Well, John, I want to thank you for joining us. As you had mentioned, there's meetings that are happening there that probably you're anxious to have an ear on, and so possibly, wrapping things up here and letting you move on with other priorities for the day. Hopefully, you'll see as a blessing to you.
Well, thank you, Ed. I appreciate the opportunity. I always enjoy having the opportunity to talk to this group and to really understand where your concerns and your priorities lie. So thank you for the time. And if questions come up as the session moves along, which I'm sure they will, don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Okay, thank you, John.
All right, thank you. I'll have a great day.
Let's move on to agenda item 6, which is information from our legislative subcommittee, Arnold Trejo.
Thank you, Ed. I think I going to start by saying I think we've touched on some of the agenda items that the legislative subcommittee discussed in our meeting. We had a very good meeting, and we didn't have a whole lot of agenda items, but the agenda items that we had much discussion. And we've discussed some of these topics already, but if anything, it kind of gives us a flavor of the consensus with the larger group, that what we were discussing were things that are the priorities of the day of the full committee. The first one was addressing FAFSA implementation, and the fact that at the federal level, we're going to have changes within the FAFSA that will no longer require selective service and drug conviction. And if that is removed from the FAFSA or at the federal level, what are the opportunities for us to align our state programs with the same requirements and not having to create more work for us, yes, but more work for the student to have to go through those certifications if the feds don't require. So again, there has been good discussion, that the legislature will be made aware of this issue. But I just wanted to mention that was one of the biggest ticket agenda items that we had in our discussion of our committee. The second topic or major topic of discussion was the net price calculator and the fact that it's being down, and the issues or concerns are obviously compliance, that we're out of compliance. However, Deshay did share with us that there was a workaround for us to alleviate that issue and have the ability to perhaps use the federal net price calculator, but that was discussed, and I think Deshay mentioned something like March 9th in terms of being able to do that. So that was discussed, and I know we have discussed this in length this morning, but the third major agenda item that we had was to discuss the TASFA, and there were concerns that, I think that we and all of us in this group, but in the financial aid community, we've been so hungry for this e-TASFA solution for so long, and so there's a sense within the committee, there was a sense of urgency. Well, let's get it done sooner rather than later. But then again, we're very cognizant within our committee as well that what's the point of building it, and then all of a sudden, because of the federal FAFSA simplification, that everything's going to change by the following year, and what would be the cost implications involved with that. So there was a good mix of tension, and not tension in contradicting each other, but rather, what do we do? What would be the best case scenario? Move along with another paper-based solution, or do we just go at it and do what we are scheduled to do by statute, and that is to have an e-TASFA by October 1 of this year. So there was a good lively discussion, and we even got into we got into okay, well, and this is into the weeds, but how do we import the data? And some of us mentioned well, we would envision, just like we get a FAFSA ICER, we would get a state ICER or eTASFA ICER, and we could load up into our banner systems or PeopleSoft systems or whatever systems we have. We need that plug-in because, we don't want to be in the data entry business either. I think we can expedite once we have that data upload into our systems, then we can start tracking the student and packaging the student just like we do with our FAFSA kids. There was discussion about the California model, and I'm glad Claudette mentioned that model. Certainly, the committee is very interested in that particular model. It would be interesting in how to hear what the outcome of that MOU is going to have. But I think it's a great start. And again, some discussions within our committee was also, okay, well, it's a great thing that we have a partnership with TA and the concept of connecting the eTASFA to the Applied Texas. And that is great for our interim freshmen hitting our campuses. But what about the returning students that we serve? How are they going to, we need an eTASFA solution for returning students on our college campuses. That was the point there. So it was a heck of a lot more questions than answers, but at least we were having a good, healthy discussion of what we envisioned the issues of the day would be. We also talked about, as Robert mentioned earlier, the need to add a more cross-representation in our committee of schools throughout the state of Texas. I feel we have good representation of 4-year pubs, 2-year, but we probably need some representation from the private institution side. And then we also asked Deshay to bring us background information about what previous legislative subcommittees have worked on, so we could have a re-examination of what the issues were in previous committee work, so we can continue some of the momentum. If some of those agenda items are worth re-examining with the issues of today, we will do so. And we talked about the next scheduled meetings. So Ed, you were there. Tell me if I'm doing justice to our report.
No, I think that's a good summary of our conversations. The only observation that I have is the importance of possibly coordinating the discussions we may be having with the subcommittee on that particular issue. Because I think a lot of things that we were thinking about, I think, are items that are on the agenda and have been identified as concerns with that committee and the expanding of that committee. I would only ask, I think, of the group if there are any questions about anything that was reported, but maybe a second item is, are there other kind of legislative issues that you might want this subcommittee to have some discussion on and seek to address and provide some thought insight for future meetings?
Arnold, I think one question that I'd have for you is, in listening to your report, I chuckle because it kind of sounds like you had a data collection subcommittee meeting as opposed to a legislative recommendation subcommittee meeting. So I just wanted to check in on, were there particular legislative action items that you wanted to bring forward for consideration, or is it more stuff that when we get to the data collection subcommittee report and Deshay talks about the net price calculator and talks about some of the other stuff that that's going to address the things that you're most interested in right now?
Right. Well, I think from a legislative standpoint, the biggest ticket item was the first agenda item, the tying in of the FAFSA simplification. And if we need a change in statute, well, we need to work with the legislature to make sure that we align the federal requirement with the state requirement or vice versa. So I think that's why we started off with that discussion. On the ETASFA, well, legislatively, we're required to have it done or operational by this fall for the subsequent year. And if we can't do that, then it's going to require legislative action. And I think that's where we're coming up with on that standpoint. Obviously, we would like to have the ETASFA automated sooner rather than later. But if it's going to create more problems, then we're going to have to address it from the legislative side to even entertain the fact of an extension. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So, and it's very helpful to hear. One of the things in listening to what Taryn said earlier, what you've mentioned, I find it helpful to hear that TASFA, the legislative subcommittee, SFAP's analysis of the FAFSA Simplification Act, we're all coming to the same kind of point that, we've got these kind of key things where we've got misalignment based on the FAFSA Simplification Act. One of them being the timeline of the TASFA, because of the big change in the FAFSA Simplification Act. If we follow the original timeline, we're going to have to build something and then immediately rebuild the entire thing for the next year. And so there's just the piece of, at what point, what's the cost benefit analysis of, because building this thing is not going to be simple in any way, shape, or form. So, that piece, the selective service piece, the drug conviction piece, are really the three things that all of us seem to have identified as these are kind of the known concerns right now. I think there's the larger piece of what exactly is the student aid index going to look like in the future, and how is that going to change? And I know right now the national, this is a long name of a group, so let me see if I can get it right. The National Association of State Student Grant and Aid Programs, NASGAP. They're actually working to see about working together to build a model of what would the changes in the SAI look like and how might they impact state grant programs, whether centralized or decentralized. So we're trying to participate with that to try to get a picture of that. That's, I've mentioned to the agency, is kind of the unknown right now, because we're not exactly sure how the Department of Ed is going to release guidance on that. With the cost of education, now that they can regulate the cost of attendance in the formula, what's that going to be? So those are kind of in the back of our minds as issues that we know we need to keep an eye out and try to get ahead of, whereas the selective service, drug conviction, and the timing of the new FAFSA, those are ones that we know right now, we're trying to we've made sure that we've let the legislative offices know about the issues. And as John said, the more that you all also let legislative office know if your institutions have concerns about this, that'll help make the point. So based on everything I just said, wanted to kind of check in with this group of, are you in agreement, or is there anything that we're missing that you think are actions right now that we need to be paying attention, other than those 3 items that we mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone feel like we've missed anything about the FAFSA Simplification Act that we really should be focusing on that hasn't been mentioned?
Chad, you mentioned the SAI, but the negative SAI, I think, is also, a bullet point on that list, because there's so much that's going to be impacted by that, and even just funding levels for, excessive need on TEG would totally change, and things that are tied to Pell can't be tied to Pell in the same way. So those are extensions of the SAI piece you mentioned, but the fact that Pell eligibility and max Pell, min Pell are new definitions that go along with that SAI and negative SAI, I think those should also be added to the list.
Would you agree that those are more in the long-term discussion items as opposed to something that we need to be trying to push in this current legislative session? Or is there something that you think that needs to be fixed in this legislative session?
I would agree that you can't fix them because you don't have good definitions of them. So I think you're on track there. But I think next legislative session is going to be too late. I don't know how we fix that, because next legislative session is the new FAFSA, but we don't know enough to present anything concrete this session. I don't know how we resolve that. I know there are some areas probably within there where they're not legislative, like guidelines on TEG and wording on TEOG and Texas grant that may be able to be tweaked within the coordinating board. So that may be an area where FAAC and TASA and some of these subcommittees could come together to suggest wording that could be changed that's not drafted at the congressional level, and maybe that could be done in a timely manner.
Cool, that's very helpful, and I appreciate that. And thank you, Arnold, for letting me kind of steal a bit of your time in this committee to just make sure that I'm understanding what as an agency we need to be thinking about. Right. Because I think Taryn's right on the money about there's legislative stuff, but there's statute, but there's also administrative code, there's also guidelines, and so at the administrative code and the guideline level, and when we get to later in the agenda, we have a discussion item on the impact of FAFSA simplification to your institutional offices, and so we can get into greater detail at that point on that. Yeah. But thank you for letting me clarify.
No, Chad, and thank you for chiming in. That's what we're all about. We welcome different perspectives and different ideas. I will just say and conclude my remarks by saying, back to the ETASFA. It'd be great to have a solution, an electronic solution by this fall. It'd be awesome, right? But we all know too well that we need to communicate to our constituencies, at the high school level and returning students about the application process. We got communications and marketing ahead of you. Just don't come up with an ETASFA solution and flip the switch and hope that everything works out well. We have to communicate. We have to do a good job of communicating it to our students and families. So that's what makes me nervous and apprehensive about a quick launch, and then nobody knows about it, or we get accused of not telling anybody, those kinds of things. So you could have some serious pushback from the community that we're desperately trying to serve. But again, I'm not suggesting to delay after delay because of those kinds of things, but we have work to do. It's not just the electronic or the modeling it after California and doing address it from the IT side. We have to address it also from the communications and marketing piece, and how do we educate our constituencies out there. But thank you all for your time.
Robert, I see your hand.
Yes, Robert from Sanjak. Arno, I think something it may be worth keeping an eye on is the promise programs. I see there are at least 3 bills that address 2-year colleges and 1 for all public higher education institutions. One of my concerns is whether or not they're going to give us new money for those promise grants, or are they going to use, make us use Texas Grant or TEOG to, as the promise grant.
Right. Absolutely. And when I saw the whole list of bills that Chad sent to us, and I said, oh my gosh, yes, Robert, as you mentioned, the promise program, and are we gonna have to use existing pots to match it? So that's one thing. And again, the whole list of exemptions that are out there, how would we implement those, but not just implement, but where would the funding shortfalls, what would it create? And so, yeah, it's I agree with you that running through that inventory, there's some matching scholarship programs in there that, immediately I started thinking, well, what funding source can I use to match that program? And what if we don't have the 50% on our side to match, then we don't get to participate in the program and further impact our financially needy students. But thank you, Robert, for bringing that up. We can certainly look at that.
Thank you.
A piece that I want to mention in relation to that list is there's the being transparent, letting you know all the things we're following. There's also the fear of overwhelming you with all the things we're following. So keep in mind that those are the bills that have been filed. And many of the programs that you just mentioned are all bills that were filed during the last legislative session as well. So they're just refilings of bills that didn't pass. We're at right now we're following about 45 bills. Last year, SFA, and those bills are just the ones related to financial aid. The agency follows hundreds upon hundreds of bills. Those are just the ones that financial aid is following, SFAP is following. We ended up following about 77 bills last legislative session. And so we're definitely at a slower pace right now. I'd highly doubt that within the next week, they're going to introduce almost 36 more bills. And so, those are pieces of the puzzle to kind of keep in mind that, you see all that activity. At the same time, it's less activity than has occurred in prior legislative sessions. They're also later in getting started with their hearings and the like, so their ability to actually hear these bills, kind of limits, they have a limit on how much they're going to be able to hear and act on. So it's going to be a very interesting next month or two to really see which of these get traction. And, I know that in the past, Leah has done some presentations with the webinars, the monthly webinars, to talk a bit about how you can go out on to Texas Legislature online and just set up alerts on bills that interest you. So that way, if these move forward, you'll have an idea that these things are moving forward. Whereas they may just sit as having been referred to committee and they don't go any further than having been referred to committee. So we'll definitely be following them. We definitely approach them, Robert, in relation to your question about are they new money? Are they current money? The promise grants that were proposed by Senator Zaffarini, we did our legislative analysis from the idea that they're their own programs that would need to be funded, as opposed to that they weren't written as a rewrite of TEOG. They were written as their own programs. Now, there are a set of collaborative promise grant programs that were recently introduced by Turner that are more about institutions of higher education and regional nonprofits and the like, and school districts kind of coming together to work together in a collaborative environment to have grant funds provided to those collaborations for them to be able to then move forward with promise programs. But those would be more grants to the collaborative organization, and the collaborative organization could be using those funds to fund scholarships, to fund administrative efforts, to fund tutoring and counseling efforts, to fund marketing efforts. So it's more about funding groups that have come together, kind of like there's the Dallas program and the Alamo Colleges program. There's different cities have created their own programs. It's more about providing funding to assist and support this regional approach to the promise. So there are different flavors of the promise legislation that's out there. And so I'll keep you aware if there's things that are out there that we see that are important to understand.
Okay, Taryn, I see your hand.
Hi, this is Taryn again. Sorry, I had another comment. To add to what Chad was saying, TASFA also has a committee that's following the bills, and we have a legislative page on our website as well with bills that impact financial aid, so people can follow them there, and they update them monthly. And then one thing I was thinking, Arnold, when you were saying, talking about how the benefit of the collaboration on eTASFA with California, who's already doing things, I did hear from NASFA that there are some states that offer state financial aid programs that are not as concerned about the changes to the simplified FAFSA because of the way the wording is in their legislature. That's simplified, that instead of coming up with its own rules, it references like follow federal regulations on this, follow federal regulations on that. So it might be worth your committee looking at some of those examples as well in terms of making recommendations, and maybe not for this session, but for the next session, that perhaps Texas goes too deep into the weeds in some areas in clarifying things that are already being done, that we could pull back a little bit to just align it on the front end. And that way we don't have to go through this and change it every time the FAFSA changes something.
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point, because you're absolutely right. We won't have to go through this exercise over and over. It's just align it with the federal, and then if the federal changes, then we're okay. So thank you so much for that.
as you all have those discussions, one of the things that John and I have discussed, the agency has discussed, but he didn't mention this morning, that we keep in mind is the challenge that comes with modifying legislation, and that when you seek to modify a statute and amend it, in doing that, you open up the whole program to other potential amendments as well. And so whether you run the risk or you have the opportunity, whichever way you look at it, you may end up with something that you weren't intending on getting in the process. For example, in the past, when proposals have been made to modify Texas Grant and amendments have been added to limit Texas Grant to U.S. citizens. So that wasn't the intent of opening up the statute, but once it's open, legislators can offer amendments. So that's a piece just to be aware of that is in everyone's mind, even elected officials' mind, of, do we tackle this? Do we want to open it up for other potential pieces? And that's a piece that Texas is unique in. As Taryn mentioned, we're a bit deeper in the weeds in how we legislate, but in doing that, we're also, we're kind of put it, we're stricter in some areas because we've got these pieces about our own piece of SAP, our own piece of drug conviction, our own piece. But we're also, I guess the opposite of strict would be lenient in other areas, in that our Texas residents are eligible for more grant programs, state grant programs, than they are for federal grant programs, because we do have the affidavit process for residency that allows you. So some of these other states that aren't facing the challenges we're facing, they have it simple because their programs just reference the federal, but it's simpler for them because their programs truly do just follow the federal guidelines. And so if we align, if we took that approach, then we're going to cut a section of people from being eligible for our Texas state programs. So that's one of the challenges. NASGAP's been having those same kind of conversations about, which states are struggling, and some states are like, oh, this is simple. It just flows through. We don't have to worry about it. One piece that we did ask our own general counsel on was whether we had any concerns about the use of the term expected family contribution in the statute and the fact that it's going to switch over to student aid index. And her interpretation is that it's not that it's going to break all of the statute and the statute won't work anymore, because there's clear guidance at the federal level that this has been a name change to the term. So it's not like something just came up and, there's no link between the two terms. It's very clear at the federal level that the expected family contribution term has been changed to the student aid index. And so there's not a feeling that we need legislation to change every reference of EFC in the statute over to SAI. So hopefully that's helpful as well. And please feel free to let me know if I'm giving you too much information. I'm just trying to be transparent about the conversations that have been happening within NASGAP, within the agency, etc.
Chad, one question I have about this idea of changing from EFC to SAI, along with, as you've mentioned, understanding what that need analysis is going to look like, and again, the resulting effect. Is there, at a higher level, is there any sense that that need analysis that will be provided will still be seen by the state, by the coordinating board, as an appropriate need analysis, versus having an alternate need analysis for state programs?
When you say appropriate, do you mean valid, like we would honor that new need analysis, or do you mean appropriate as in we still feel that at its core, it's a solid need analysis that supports state grants?
Yeah. I mean,
which one
of
those?
Yeah, I guess it's the idea of, is the current approach say, hey, we need to adjust for, hey, there's going to be a new number that's going to be provided, and we've got to understand what effect that might have to eligibility of the students and funds and all of that, or that at that level, and or is it the level of saying, hey, we really I guess it's is that where it's at, or is there some thought of we need a better need analysis to fairly distribute our state programs? Because I think for some schools are looking at it and saying, and some schools already have a different need analysis for their own institutional programs, and even some states have, I think, if I understand right, an alternate need analysis that they utilize in some way for their state programs. But is there any concern about that these dollars with this new index number, that dollars are still going to go to the students that the coordinating board believes the dollars should go to? So I don't know if I clarified or just complicated, kind of the question. But.
Okay. Well, I think right now we're looking at from the standpoint of, will the SAI be a valid piece? Like, is the state going to accept the new SAI for you to use in making your determinations? So from that standpoint, yes, we're not concerned that suddenly you can't use the SAI anymore, that our programs are broken and will have to be completely fixed. From the much deeper question that you've had of, is the SAI an appropriate structure to determine a family's ability to afford higher education? That's a lot of what the work that we're doing to try to figure out what exactly is changing about the SAI, and will it have an underlying strength to it, in still determining which are the highest need students. Because that's one thing, again, that's unique about Texas versus other states. Other states have programs where they're kind of like Pell, in that they have different levels of, the amount that you get, is tied to, are you in this range of your EFC? Are you in this range of your EFC, etc.? Many states are centralized in that the state is determining what that amount is going to be, as opposed to the institution figuring out who is going to get that award. Whereas with Texas, we're decentralized. We provide a block grant out to the institution, and within the eligibility criteria, you determine who you're going to be awarding that to, and we have at most in the Texas grant program a priority EFC of who would give priority, but it really just divides it into two buckets. It's you're in the priority EFC or you're not in the priority EFC. The Texas grant program doesn't get into the details of the difference between a negative $1,500 SAI and a $6,000 SAI. That it's all the same person, they're all the same group of that. So our review would be much more from that level of just, is it still a valid indicator to put you in one of the two groups, either priority or not priority EFC, as opposed to, is it available? Is the person who lands at $1,000 in the EFC right now compared to the $1,000 SAI in the future, that nuance is not as much of what we're focused on, if that makes sense. Ed, did I come close to kind of addressing that or not?
Yeah, I think so. I think it, I mean, kind of what I hear, which, it seems like basically just changing from an EFC to an SAI in where that is referenced, and then moving forward with programs as they are is really where things are at now. And that seems to not be a difficult thing to do.
Right. And as you mentioned, like with institutions, you're dealing with a lot more pieces of the puzzle. You're trying to figure out a number of different sources and how you'll use them, and, figuring out the need that you want to try to meet, in those pieces of the puzzle. And that's definitely a different equation than what determining eligibility for TEG, TEOG, or Texas Grant is. And so, I would definitely see that institutions have other pieces that they're going to need to think about when it comes to that piece of the puzzle. And there was something else. What was it? You had said something and it made me think about the SAI. Shoot. It just left my head, and I apologize for that.
That's all right. Arnold, you had your hand?
Yes, sir. Chad, since we've been talking about some state requirements being easier than federal requirements, and that's why that's a good thing, and we support that. And Taryn, I might need your help on this one, but I think that another alignment that perhaps we need to look at or consider is the satisfactory academic progress policy alignment. Because when it comes to Texas Grant, we have a federal policy that's more lenient than the state policy when the students hit the second year on our campuses. And to me, that's a Texas Grant cliff for some of my kids or some of our students. And again, this is what I'm reading from the TASFA recommendations. So I'm just going to say that I'm echoing what I'm reading here, Taryn. So if you want to chime in, but I think that that's an opportunity for us to build that case, because when you drop a freshman comes in, we give them Texas Grant and Pell Grant. It's a sweet package. We got them tuned in, but the kiddo, the most difficult year in our view in higher education is the freshman year, adjusting to college life and all the different challenges that it presents. That's the most difficult year. And then if that kiddo makes a 2.2 or 2.1, and I recognize that there's an appeals mechanism, but isn't there an opportunity there to align both policies for the sake of not having those students go through an appeal process that perhaps we might even lose them. They might not even file an appeals. So Taryn, chime in if you will, please.
Hold on, trying to unmute.
Taryn, you muted yourself.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. This is an area I think TASFA has brought before FAAC in the past, and we have discussed. And so this year, when the board looked at areas of alignment, which kind of seem to be the theme of the TASFA recommendations, SAP came forward as an old area that could still be brought forward for alignment as opposed to the Fafsa simplifications. But I think for counseling students and for a goal of graduating students, the SAP policies not aligning is a hindrance to that. And it does make it difficult to explain to a student, to help, even for academic advising. It's hard enough to get our academic advisors on campus to understand federal SAP policy and the complicated terminology that could go along with that may not match up with your academic policies. But then on top of that, to have to explain that the completion rate that we're looking for state aid, but only if you're a second year student and happen to be a Texas resident, is something different. And the credits we're looking for is something different. And the time frame we're looking at is also potentially something different if you're a school that reviews at the end of every payment period. For instance, we have students that can go into suspension on one program and not on another. And that makes it extremely difficult to help get the student to graduation and guarantee their funding. So I think there's an opportunity there for alignment of terminology, time frame, and time of review, in addition to the actual standards that we're looking for, which I realize that's a big can of worms to open, but it was definitely something that was supported by the board members who reviewed the several recommendations that we had and decided that that one would be a priority that we'd like considered.
And Arnold, I'll mention, that when you have a chance to read the legislative recommendations from the prior legislative recommendation subcommittee chair, that was a key one that was part of that, that alignment is a big theme in all of these pieces. I do want to mention, for the sake of clarity for anyone who may be listening on this meeting, that the example you used wasn't quite accurate. Someone going from their first year to their second year follows institutional SAP policy. It's going from your second year to your third year. So it's at the end of the sophomore. Right. So I didn't want anyone to walk away thinking they were doing their SAP policy incorrectly. So
no, I'm sorry about that. Yes, that's true.
It is aligned going into your first renewal year is aligned, but then your second renewal year and beyond is where that misalignment occurs. But yes, that has definitely been raised in the past. And I think misalignment is the biggest theme that has come up in the past as well.
And I will add to Taryn's comment. It's time to degree issue, but also when the students don't meet the SAP Texas grant requirement, we could lose them, or they go to student loans because all of a sudden we cut $5,000 worth of grant aid. We're not doing a good service. We're trying to minimize loan debt in our campuses, and we're putting needy students in that pipeline by not aligning. And I'll stop at that. I mean,
well, I think you've made a great point.
It's a time to degree, but also a debt management issue that we're trying to tackle in our campuses.
Yep. And I think an underlying piece of what you're saying there as well is the fact that low-income students are expected to perform at a higher academic level than high-income students. High-income students simply need to be able to meet whatever allows them to stay enrolled at your institution, whereas a low-income student has to achieve this higher academic performance in order to retain the funding that allows them to go to college. And, if they lose it, it's either loans or dropping out as a result. And so I think that it's not even broader than the complication of the, trying to counsel on that. And I empathize with you in doing that counseling. I never had to do it here, but in New York actually had two different types of appeal processes that you had to go through for your state aid, because they had their own formula based on New York income, which was different than federal income, and then they had their own SAP. But you could appeal for your one-time C waiver, or you could appeal for your multiple-time SAP waiver. And so I feel for you there. But there's this underlying piece of we're holding low-income students to a higher performance expectation than students who don't rely on aid to go to school.
Has there, I'm wondering, with this topic, and I do, I think want to wrap up this and get to the break, but has there been any research about retention and graduation rates of students who are losing that Texas grant going into that third year at the state level, or has institutions done that? I mean, I think that would be something maybe for the subcommittee to understand. I mean, I think in theory that impact and the inequity of a higher standard, all those things totally agree with. But, the actual, is this resulting in students not persisting and not graduating, I think would be a compelling piece of information to bring forward as to why this should change with, again, the 30 by 60 overall goal of the state. And if we're failing to graduate students that were getting started in their education, that certainly would appear to be an opportunity to align with those broad goals that the state has. And so
at this point, Ed, to the best of my knowledge, at the agency level, I'll let the rest of you speak as to whether you've done it at an institutional level, but I am not aware of having done a broad-based review of statewide aid to try to identify kind of how does it impact, and are there, one of the questions I actually just was chatting with our deputy chief of staff on, whether or not there's any kind of disparate impact that the SAP policy has based on institution, whether or not, certain institutions are hit harder by this based on the populations they serve, and could that then roll into impacting how funds are being allocated to institutions. And so, I think that this piece is ripe for a larger review to try to understand. With the changes to the FAD that were instituted in 2018, I'm hopeful that we might have more data to help us try to understand this piece of the puzzle. And the agency as a whole, in the past year, with the arrival of Commissioner Keller and his focus on using data to help us make better decisions or more supportive decisions. Hopefully it's something that we can dig further into. Are we going to be able to dig into it in the next 3 days so that they can propose a bill before next Friday's deadline? No. But I think it's something that we can, continue to investigate and continue to discuss, as you said, to try to put some numbers behind it as opposed to just theory behind it.
Okay, so I think let's take a break now. Following kind of the timeline that I had, we were ahead of schedule and we've gotten a little behind schedule, not in any significant way. But good conversation. So let's plan to reconvene right at 11:15. So you have a 10-minute break and then 5 minutes to get ready to start the meeting. So however you want to consider the length of the break, but let's break until 11:15 and then we'll pick up on agenda item number 7, the data collection subcommittee. According to my watch, we're at 11:15, so we're going to reconvene. It looks like folks are rejoining us. Just wait a quick minute more, and then we'll need to do a roll call just to establish the quorum again, and then we can move on with the agendas for today. So let's begin like we had before. As I call your name, just affirm your attendance. Denise Welch?
Here.
Robert Marino?
Here.
Chad?
Here.
Ben Bowen?
He has stepped off the meeting for a bit.
Right. That's what I thought. Joanna Borley? Victoria Chen?
Here, Foley.
Okay, thank you. Rochelle?
Here.
Dee Dee?
Here.
Heidi?
Oop. I'm here. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Bridget?
Here.
Okay, Tam?
Here.
Holly?
Here.
Shauna?
Here.
Stephen?
Here.
Thomas? Kelly?
I'm here.
Okay, Joy?
Here.
Foreman Thompson?
Here.
Welcome. I see that you joined us a little later.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Arnold?
Here.
And then Jace.
Here.
Okay. So it does look like we have a quorum. I see, Thomas, you've joined us, so we'll make note of that. And we'll continue on the agenda. Item number 7, the Data Collection Subcommittee. Dee Dee Gonzalez.
Good morning. The Data Collection Subcommittee met on February 25th, and Deshay gave the committee several updates. One of those was for the 21 FAD cycle that has just opened up. There's a new format for the reconciliation report. There will be a breakout between the state appropriated and gear funds, and you'll have a warning alert if the student or dollar amounts don't align on that. Of course, reconciliation is not required until cycle 3, but at least we'll know well ahead of time because the reconciliation report will include that information if there are any issues. The next item was we discussed the minimal changes that are needed for the 22 Fad Instruction Manual. Very minor things like updating the annual award amounts, removing CARES and GEARS alerts, and then the committee did discuss the cycle dates for the 22 FADs and didn't have any issues with those. She also discussed the 21-22 program guidelines that are planned for the end of April. There are very minimal changes with those as well. Updating annual award amounts, links to relevant rules in the headers, FAQs, things like that. She did ask the committee to check with their staff and make sure if there was any additional updates that might be needed to the program guidelines to make them clearer. Anything they may need to add, so the committee is taking that back to see if there's any additional feedback. She also gave some updates for the student financial aid programs. Mentioned they're continuing to be a part of the legislative session, as been mentioned today, that they have several other initiatives as well, such as the refinement of the 60 by 30 goals, the modernization project that they're undertaking, and redesigning the agency's website. Specifically for the Office of Student Financial Aid, the 21-22 award amounts were released for the grant programs, And she did give an update on loan delinquency reporting, that a notice was sent to institutions, that the coordinating board reinstated the cumulative loan delinquency report, and then reminded us that institutions should not be placing students on an academic hold related to a THECB delinquency. The Fafsa Simplification was also discussed, as has been here many times today. The selective service, drug conviction issues, the timing of the online TASFA net price calculator, which I think Deshae is going to mention in a agenda item later on, was discussed. And also Pell for incarcerated students. It has that listed as urgent because there's a bill to expand certificate and degree programs available to incarcerated students, and need to figure out if these students are eligible for state aid. She also talked about the memos that had recently been released by the coordinating board, and those are listed in the handout. And then the committee decided on the schedule for the future meetings for the year. So that was pretty much it in a nutshell. Are there any questions? Okay.
Ed, I would say that, oh, it sounds like maybe Deshae was just about to jump in.
Oh, yes. I was going to circle back around on that net price calculator update that Dee Dee mentioned, as well as Arnold mentioned. And this is really just to give a good briefing to the Financial Aid Advisory Committee. What I wanted to indicate was that, as you know, the coordinating board is required to provide a state net price calculator tool for estimating the cost of attendance at public institutions of higher education within Texas. The net price calculator application that's hosted on the College for All Texans website unexpectedly reached a point in November of 2020 where it was no longer functional and the coordinating board could no longer support it, so we did have to disable it. The coordinating board staff, in collaboration with the Financial Aid Advisory Committee chairs, as well as the data collection subcommittee, agreed to an interim solution to allow the agency and institutions to be compliant with state and federal statutes. The solution requires public institutions to create a template by using the Department of Education's net price calculator and supplying that template to the coordinating board. The data for the NPC is going to be required by all institutions. However, some private institutions in the past have submitted data for that net price, and they can continue to do so through this new solution. The templates will be hosted as a comprehensive listing of links on a new state NPC webpage, which still can be accessed through the College for All Texans website. This particular approach will help cover at least a year or two while we work with institutions to redesign a more stable and functional net price calculator tool. My area, the financial aid services, will provide training and support to help institutions complete the process for delivering the file to us. We will announce this particular approach the next week, along with doing a demonstration of the Department of Education's net price calculator tool during the March webcast, which is scheduled for March 9th at 1:30. So again, I wanted to bring the committee, the Financial Aid Advisory Committee as a whole, to the attention of this new approach, because again, it is quite different than our previous net price calculator, because we are going to use the Department of Education net price calculator tool. I will make a note that the Department of Education's net price calculator tool asks for 2 different academic periods, and we will be asking for data for the 18-19 academic period. That is slightly different because beforehand the 19-20 was being asked for the state, but because the Department of Education is behind and right now they haven't quite upgraded that particular template, we'll be asking for 18-19. We will not require institutions to go back and give us 19-20. We will continue with the 18-19 until we do the net price calculator collection again. by that time, the Department of Education should have their template available with the most current data. We will also supply the college student budgets that we have on file for the 2018-19 to schools, so you do not have to go back and look for previous data that was already published with the coordinating board. So that will be one additional resource that we will provide for the institutions. So I want to go ahead and pause right there in case there are additional questions from the advisory committee. Some of you all have probably heard me talk about this. Again, like I mentioned earlier, we spoke with the FAC committee chairs as well as the data collection subcommittee, and I introduced this approach during the February TASFA board as well.
This is Ed. Just one point of clarification. All that we're going to need to do to comply with the state requirement of net price calculator, and then if we're using the states as satisfying the federal requirement, is to complete the template and submit that to you. We won't need to do anything on the federal site or any other providing of data, but just completing that template and submitting it to you, and then through that, the net price calculator on the state website will be available.
Yes, that is accurate. I have looked at the Department of Education when I went out to their particular link, and they have a listing of all the schools. So it does reroute back to the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board's website. So if a student goes out there and looks at their listing as well, it will reroute. So there's nothing that a school will need to do on the Department of Education side because we are connected. So once it's available on our site, and that would be up to the school. So the sooner that you provide that, once we release this particular approach and the steps and the instructions, then it will be visible on both ends.
Any other questions for Deshay or for Dee Dee in the subcommittee? Okay, then let's move forward to agenda item number 8, which is the Texas Student Financial Aid Association TASFA report from Taryn Anderson.
Hello, this is Taryn. 2 of the items have, I think, been covered and beaten into the ground at this point. So, which is fine. I'm glad you all know and we're all on the same page. So there was just one additional recommendation that hadn't come up yet that I wanted to cover. It is number 2 on that list, which is actually another area for alignment between the federal side and the state side that we wanted to recommend, which is the bringing together the idea of the student debt letter and the annual loan acknowledgement, which it was delayed, but will now should be coming about for this upcoming year, and the process for that, and schools making sure that students understand their federal loan debt as a component of continuing to borrow federal loans. And whether there are components within the student debt letter that could be modified as kind of an initial request, but there are additional steps that certain TASFA members are already sending letters, I know, and are already working with the legislature to actually convert this process to where the loan information that the state has submitted through the FADs by our schools is more comprehensive data and would actually be a better, that you all, the state, would provide better information to the students than even what we can provide on that debt letter. And if we could explore a process for sending students to view their state and even private loan debt in some kind of state database or state system, similar to what the federal government side is now doing potentially as a model. So it's not getting rid of that requirement. I think everyone's on the same page that we want to make sure that our students understand how much they're borrowing, but just that the student debt letter process was already viewed by some as not the best way to get that information to students. But now with the annual debt letter, I think there's even an additional question of that and the additional requirement on the schools. And if we're giving the best information to the students to actually accomplish what the state wants to accomplish by having us provide that letter annually. So that was the final recommendation. If anyone had any additional questions or concerns at the TASFA level. The only other update I had in addition to that was that the state of Texas is offering training for TASFA members, and THECB is participating in that. So we are getting state updates as part of our free training that we're offering in the month of March. The state and federal government will both give updates. So thank you for the coordinating board for continuing to support training our members in that effort. And then we also will be training new aid officers, our new financial aid administrators in the state of Texas with less than 2 years. I know a lot of you on here have already signed your new TASFA or your new administrators up for that training. And Deshay and Leah are also going to be participating and helping us with making sure that new administrators understand state policies. So those are some of the upcoming events where our two organizations will be coordinating.
Any questions or comments?
Robert?
Yeah, Taryn, I don't know if you want to give a plug about the nominations.
Yes, that would be great. We're I know it's coming up on the agenda for FAAC, but TASFA is also looking for our future board members and future presidents. We just opened up our nomination process for that as well. So if you have leaders within your organization or within the state, we really want to make sure that we represent the state from a diversity in terms of areas and types of schools and all the different types of members that we represent. So that is also currently open, and anyone is welcome to nominate an individual to be considered to one of our board positions or for a future president position. Thank you, Robert.
Taryn, you mentioned when you were talking about the debt letter, you made some comment about you all TASFA reaching out to legislators or things like that with recommendations. It would be helpful if you would share what you've suggested with us, so that way we know what's suggested, and if any legislature circles back and asks us about it,
sure,
we're already kind of understanding what it is that you're looking, because I wouldn't want to give my thought thinking that I'm in line and then discover that I'm saying something totally different than what TASFA's thinking.
Yeah. So TASFA is working on some pieces right now, and in the specific institution that I know is Dr. Murr at Texas State. So I don't know if you've seen his draft, but I'll ask his permission, and Dee Dee sent it to us and share it with y'all. Dee Dee, do you know who he has sent that to most recently?
No, I sure don't.
Okay, it has some really good data in it. I mean, he did a really good deep dive, and so I'll talk to him and then share that with y'all, chat, and try to get an idea of who he has submitted it to as well.
Great, thank you.
All right, the next 4 agenda items, actually, Chad, are yours. So unless otherwise advised, just will allow you to move through these 4 agenda items.
Talking away and you can't hear me as I talk. Okay, I've unmuted and now you can hear me. So the first item I wanted to talk about was the FAC nominations. We are going to be getting ready to start that process. Wanted to confirm with you all whose terms will be ending. The following people, the September meeting will be their last meeting. Taryn Anderson will finish her one-year term as TASFA rep. Paul Gallion had to step down actually from the committee, but his term was ending in September. Heidi Granger is finishing up with the September meeting. Robert Marino will finish his long tenure, having gone through the whole vice chair, chair, and past chair cycle. One thing for everyone to think about is that with Robert leaving the committee, we'll need a new TASFA subcommittee chair. So that's something for people to start thinking about who would like to step up and take that on. And there's nothing that says we have to wait until he's gone to have someone else start. Something we can definitely talk about in the June meeting as to whether or not there's a new chair to join in. Tam Nguyen is wrapping up her time, and Kelly Steelman is wrapping up her time. Having said that, I want to pause and just check to make sure if there's anyone that I said your name and you didn't think your time was wrapping up, or anyone who you think you're done, but I didn't say your name. If you would just let me know. Hearing no comments, I believe we have the right folks. We will be sending out the notices. The timeline in April is when we send out the announcements specifically to the presidents and chancellors of Texas public and private and independent institutions. When we do that, we also send a copy of the announcement out to all of you as FAC members. We send it out to our internal Gov Delivery financial aid interest list. We send it out to a group of financial aid advisory committee partner agencies and professional associations so that they're aware. We send it out to the TASFA listserv. We also send it to the Texas Association of Secondary School Principals, the Texas Association of School Administrators, and we also have an agency list of school district staff. So we send it out to that much broader list. So we do our best to make sure everyone's aware of it. The nominations do need to come from someone who can authorize the nominee's time away from the office and any expenses that the nominee may incur. So it's not something that you can self-nominate or someone nominates their boss or something like that. It has to be someone who can authorize the time away and expenses incurred. So I won't go through the entire timeline with you. It's in the handout of the materials. But we will get that together, and during the summer, we'll have assemble a proposed slate that I'll present to this group. Actually, Deshay will present, I think, to this group in September on that, and then the board will vote on that in October for individuals to join in December. Any questions about the nomination process? Okay, then I'm just going to jump up and see it. So the next piece is the discussion of our Texas Administrative Code. The Financial Aid Advisory Committee does have a section of the Texas Administrative Code, and it's in the handouts that were posted. And as I mentioned in the prior meeting, we need to take we need to propose amendments to the administrative code that we'll be doing this summer in order to extend the term of the Financial Aid Advisory Committee. All advisory committees expire after 4 years and have to be reconvened by the board. And so we will be proposing that amendment. We also had discussed previously about needing to amend the information on membership, that we would have one student representative as opposed to 2 student representatives. So that'll be incorporated into the proposed amendments. But wanted to take the time to talk today about whether there are any other changes that the Financial Aid Advisory Committee thinks are important for us to consider for the coming review by the board for the 4-year renewal. In the materials that I sent out, I did highlight 2 items. One was in relation to the committee membership and officers. We have language that talks about other persons employed in the nonprofit sector in roles with responsibility for advising students regarding financial aid. And right now, I'm not sure exactly how we feel we're achieving that goal of having those individuals represented on the board. And then the other piece is an item as to when committee terms start. We had talked about 1.5 years ago, actually, about the potentially changing the nomination cycle so that we actually were wrapping up the whole getting all the nominations in the springtime, starting a little earlier and getting it so that new individuals started in September as opposed to starting in December. And that also provides the opportunity for a couple of reasons behind it were so that stuff wasn't happening over the summer when really there's not a lot of people around to get some of this stuff done, especially on the public school side, as well as we would be able to elect the vice chair in the September meeting as opposed to the December meeting, so we don't go kind of 3 months without a vice chair. And I had originally thought that that was just a matter of switching the nomination cycle. And then I found this little phrase in the administrative code that talks about it says the new providing officer's term will begin with the second committee meeting of each year, as will each year of committee members' terms. And so we have it in the rule that new committee members don't start until the September meeting. And so wanted to touch base with you on that piece as to whether going back to what we talked about 1.5 years ago of changing the nomination cycle and having people start in September, whether you all felt, yes, that is a good change, and we should amend the administrative code to allow us to do that, or whether you feel we should just leave the administrative code the way it is on that particular piece, and thus keep our current nomination cycle. So that's one specifically that I wanted to, but also wanted your input on what you felt needed to change within our administrative code.
Thomas, I see your hand.
Yeah, just a quick question to kind of backtrack. I recall that when we were talking about the student situation and having student representation on the committee, that we addressed with some good discussion about the community college level and how that's a very difficult way to accomplish having a student join us just because we had a 2-year expectation for them, and with the community college structure that's hard. Did we opt to just shift down to just having one student rep because of the difficulties of getting a student, and then striking the language to make that a little bit more broad so as to make that opportunity available for community college students, although that would still be a challenge for them? Is that the direction that we're landing on this?
You're muted, Chad.
Luckily, I was muted, so you couldn't hear the word I just said. Oh
dear.
I'm just not doing well with my muting today. I apologize. Yes, the administrative code had specifically indicated one individual from university and health-related institutions and one individual from community colleges. And so based on the discussion, we decided to switch it to just one individual from public institutions of higher education. It still allows for a community college student to be nominated, if there was someone who would fit in with the expectations, but it doesn't require us to find a student from a community college.
Okay, I appreciate that. Is it still a 2-year commitment? I'm trying to reread it to refresh my memory.
Yes, and the 2-year commitment is actually not specific to Financial Aid Advisory Committee. It relates to all of the advisory committees at the agency. So that's across all of them as opposed to just us.
Okay, which I do understand the logic for that. I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
I have a quick question on the student piece. It doesn't suggest that the student has to be a Texas resident. Is that not a requirement? Or does it say that somewhere else? I was just curious in terms of considering which students we might want to hear from.
I don't believe that there are restrictions that, but I would need to check the statute to be sure as to whether or not there's anything that specifically requires someone to be a Texas resident in order to participate. If I do, following up on that, if I review the statute and the rule and there isn't anything that requires Texas residency, does the FAC want that to be built into the next revision of this administrative code?
Denise?
Well, I would think that it would be kind of at least have Texas funds or be eligible to get Texas funds for it to be a vital conversation with the student. That's my thoughts.
So Chad, maybe it's taken care of in the selection process. I was glancing at it as kind of a first-time person to look at it. I just thought, I'm surprised that it doesn't indicate at least that they're a Texas resident, or as Denise said, going one step farther to being someone eligible or receiving Texas state aid.
When I'm trying to pull up the nomination form or the information that's sent out to the presidents and chancellors in terms of making the nomination to see if I can find whether or not it makes any comments in there. Ah, shoot. Agency. Yeah, I'll have to do some digging because I'm not finding stuff real quick as to what exactly we say on those pieces. I'll let you all know. In terms of the membership cycle, do people feel that we should pursue a change in the administrative code for the terms to begin with the September meeting, or should we leave the administrative code as is? Oh, Shauna has her hand up. Sorry. I just noticed that Shauna has had her hand up, and I don't know if we've called on her.
Well, I had my hand up for a different reason a while ago, but I'll talk about the committee. You're making changes to the code anyway, correct? So it's not like it would just strictly have to go forward because of that one change for the committee.
No, we have to, no matter what, I have to put something forward because I have to change the abolishment date. So at minimum, I'll be taking that forward. And it's just, is there anything else that the committee as a whole feels should be addressed at this time? Because it's better for us to take it all to the board at once, as opposed to piecemealing the board, every meeting with here's another thing we want to change. Here's another thing we want to change.
Okay, thank you. I liked the change in committee terms initially, but.
And this is Rochelle. I agree. I think the time frame needs to change to September.
Okay.
It just makes more sense.
Great. Well, given that we already discussed the idea of the September and that I'm not hearing anyone oppose the idea of changing the administrative code, I will adjust the language such that terms of the committee start with the first committee meeting of each academic year or state fiscal year rather than the second of each state fiscal year. So I'll make that adjustment.
Dee, I saw your hand, then you took it away.
I was just going to ask, I thought I heard Chad say that there was some difficulty getting nominations in the way it is currently, and confirm if I heard that correctly.
Yes, that trying to collect nominations over the summer has just led to, we actually moved the nomination process up to April to try to get nominations when more activity is happening, both on college campuses and especially at public schools. With moving it up to April, part of the challenge was people were getting nominated in April, and by the time I was reaching out to them and them starting, they weren't starting until December, and so trying to narrow the window so that people don't forget about this thing that they said that they would be joining.
Yeah, but for that reason, I think it makes sense. I agree. It makes sense to change it.
Are there any other aspects that people have any concerns or questions on in terms of how the membership is divvied up across the different sectors, or about kind of what we've laid out in terms of our membership terms and meeting expectations and the like? For people's background, the tasks assigned to the committee, the very last portion, very much comes from the statute that creates the Financial Aid Advisory Committee. And so that's, in case you're wondering, kind of where does the purpose and then at the end, where do the tasks come from? A lot of that is pulled directly from the statute to capture those pieces. Well, then I guess my final question for you all is to get your guidance on, if you look specifically at section 1.151, which starts at the bottom of the first page of the handout. It talks about the fact that membership shall consist of financial aid practitioners, public school counselors, and other persons employed in the nonprofit sector in roles with responsibility for advising students regarding financial aid. And kind of needing your thoughts on how do we get those members? I described earlier how we do the nomination process and who all we're advertising to, but most of that advertising is, going out to either individuals working on higher education campuses or individuals working at public schools. And we haven't lately had much by way of nominations from nonprofit, and didn't know if you had any suggestions for us on how to try to garner those. Taryn?
Chad, we have, some of our vendor members in TASFA would meet this qualification. So it might just be that when we draft the notice to TASFA membership about it, we maybe specifically point that out. There's just not a school opportunity. It potentially is an opportunity for that sector as well. But I can think of a few of our sponsor members in TASFA who would meet that qualification.
Okay. Well, as you say that, one of the things that makes me think of it too is that it may help if we make the nomination form more clear, because the nomination form is kind of very structured in a university setting kind of thing. And so we can look at how to make the nomination form itself clearer, that it can be submitted for these different purposes.
We can also segment the mailing, the notification on our side if you want to the different populations, to the 4-year, 2-year, the sponsor nonprofit side. So our system allows for us to do that. So if you want to work with me to draft like a different message to those groups to try and hit them individually, we could do that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. This is Foreman. That is great. And as I'm reading through this, my question was kind of how are we publicizing, or how are we going about letting the community or the nonprofit, even the ISDs, know about this? So just here locally in Midland, I've been here for 2 years now, and I'm not aware of my financial aid folks being involved, which I'm pushing that to include the local ISDs here. So how are we getting this information out to the ISDs?
To the ISDs, we actually we reach out both to professional associations as well as doing a mass mailing to individuals that work in school districts. So we reach out, we send an announcement to the Texas Association of Secondary School Principals and the Texas Association of School Administrators. But the thing that we found has worked best is our college readiness and success area has a list with thousands of individuals from school districts across the state. And so we send it out in this mass email blast so that we can hit all the different school districts and try to let as many people know about it as possible so that, you know, while you can't self-nominate in the sense of turning the form in for yourself, you can absolutely, you know, go to your principal and ask, you know, to be nominated for this, if that's not something that, you know, some principals are on top of these things and identifying, and it happens at the college campus as well, that, you know, some presidents are just right on top of it, and other presidents, you know, wait for someone to come to them to say, hey, you know, let's nominate our financial aid director for this. But that, when we made the change and started mailing to this big list of individuals, we went from getting 0 nominations to getting, you know, a good half dozen nominations each year for a pool to be able to choose from, and great quality nominations. Like every single nominee is qualified to participate. Well, if anyone else has some ideas on how to try to get the message out, or get the message out more clearly to individuals who are working in the nonprofit sector, please don't hesitate to let me know. We'll be working on the materials this month to get them all assembled, and we will distribute those materials in April. I will make the adjustment to the administrative code so that we propose the change to the abolishment date to extend that another 4 years, so that we change the student representative to 1 student representative, and so that we change the terms to begin with the September rather than the December meeting. And I will get those. Those will go to the July board meeting for approval. So, okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate your input on that. I am jumping up to the agenda to remember the next thing I'm supposed to be talking about. And the next thing for me to talk about is the impact of Fafsa Simplification Act on institutional aid offices. I know we've talked a bunch about this already today, but a piece that I wanted to make sure that we took some time to talk about is not just how the Fafsa Simplification Act has kind of knocked some of our programs out of alignment, but also anything that you think that it would be helpful for the agency to understand of what is the impact going to be on your institutions. You know, what are you thinking about in terms of what's going to have to change, what concerns you have as you try to think about it for your own administration of financial aid. You know, our group at the agency has very much been trying to kind of read the statute and read the state statute and figure out those kind of differences. But, you know, it's been 6 years since I ran an aid office. And so I am not going to say I'm the expert on, you know, how this is going to impact you all on the day-to-day basis. And so I'd like to just hear from you as to what are the things that you're worrying about with the Fafsa Simplification Act in terms of how you're going to operate your organizations. Taryn?
One area that we're concerned about, and I'm at a small private school, so this may be different for other schools, but is the change that the timing of the change and how there will be students that come into our university as a Pell Grant recipient that will no longer be a Pell Grant recipient after a year or two. We specifically deal with a significant number of families that have multiple children in college at the same time, which is a big factor that's changing on the new FAFSAs, how that impacts the SAI calculation. So that's one of the areas that we're keeping an eye on, and have talked to a few other people about that, because obviously we can't afford to lose those students once they're here, and that's not what we want. But if they lose federal funding, and then if potentially it impacts other areas because they're no longer Pell eligible, that would put them in a hole. And how can we counsel students on that on the front end once we see a little bit more of a draft of what that calculation is going to look like? But that's one area that I'm looking at in terms of how the SAI will be calculated differently, especially in taking into account family size and number in college.
Yeah, and this is Ed, and related to that, thinking about how that might affect state program eligibility for renewal year, and seeing a student in their third or fourth year, EFC taking them out of range to have their scholarship renewed, whereas under the old calculation, with that number in college, and realize, again, that's something that's moved in the past as well, as there are a number in college from year to year, but the idea that the negative effect of that, what would that transition be? So
kind of Taryn talking a bit about literally the impact on the Pell eligibility as to whether you fall in or out of the EFC, the SAI range for the Pell. Ed, it sounds like you're talking more about, with the SII change, the potential that an upper class student's need diminishes so much that they'll no longer be able to get a Texas grant. Am I hearing you correctly, Ed?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's a scenario that I've thought about.
Yeah. I think one thing, kind of again, when we align with feds versus we don't align with feds. One thing that's helpful for the state programs is that for the 3 state grant programs, there's not a EFC cutoff in the upper class years. There's the priority EFC for Texas grant in the first year, but then in the upper class, in the renewal years, it's just based on, do they have the need to be eligible for it. So that'll give aid administrators more flexibility on the state grant programs than will exist with the Pell Grant program. Again, sometimes our weird Texas way of doing things helps us, sometimes not so much. Other concerns you have about kind of how this is going to impact your offices?
I saw your hand. Yeah. And then Denise next.
Immediately, I think about how different this need calculation is and our systems being able to accommodate it. We're so heavily reliant on our systems. And so, I'm praying the vendors get all this information well ahead of time so that they're prepared. And how do you even explain? I mean, seems much more complicated, easier for the student to fill out, complicated on the back end. So being able to explain how this works is a concern, and our systems being able to accommodate the changes is a concern.
And to piggyback on that, our systems are going to have to figure it out, but also that selective service database match, instead of relying on that if there's a discrepancy, the students are going to have to turn something in now. And so that's just going to make more work for the students that are typically high need and low income. And so that's just another burden that we're putting on them when the whole goal is to reduce the burden. So I think it's real complicated when it comes to our systems versus what we have to collect from the student. And now, don't get me wrong, it's easy to go on selective service, put in your social, and you get your confirmation right there. It's not like income tax return transcript or something like that. It's real easy to do. It's just one more thing that they have to do. And that's my concern.
Yeah. And that's a piece that Leah Smalley and I have been emailing back and forth for the past couple days, and realizing that we're going to want to talk more with institutions. We might call this data and toss it into the data collection subcommittee for a discussion. But trying to figure out if there isn't a statutory change to align the state with the feds, if that doesn't happen, what can we do from an administrative code standpoint to best support your ability to handle, that discrepancy? Because, only the legislature can change the misalignment. We're not able to, say, oh, well, regardless of that statute, we're just going to tell you not to worry about it. We can't do that piece of the puzzle. But if there's a way that we can think together as to, what would you, barring what we say in rule right now and just the concept of the statute, what would your all kind of ideal way of, okay, if we have to do it, here's how we'd want to do it, so that we can see, can we build an administrative code? Can we build information and guidelines that best support you in doing that? So I think that's going to be a key discussion. The drug conviction one isn't as big an issue because we've been a little bit misaligned with the feds for a while now. And so we've had to have that separate statement at the state level. So that's already incorporated into the work that you do. But if there's ways that we can find to really brainstorm to make our code and guidelines, I won't say easy, because I know it's not going to be easy. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are going to have to be confirmed. But if there's a way for us to do that, we'll definitely work with you on that. So,
Chad, I want to. This is Arnold. I want to chime in. And Denise have just mentioned, yes, there's systems issues, as Didi indicated, and then there's issues, as Denise articulated, in having our needy kids going through this process. But in the aid community, it also has auditing implications. If it's a requirement out there and we don't have that certification, we're going to get dinged on an audit, regardless whether it's a federal requirement or not. So that's a concern. And, we've talked about this morning and this afternoon, we've talked about how our overall systems, all the barriers that are out there for the most neediest students. I've also read literature on or articles on how the students of color or low-income students are verified at a higher rate than all other students at the federal level. So that's another barrier. And of course, Chad, I'm not offering any answers but it's a culmination of all these things that add up to barriers to our students and having, because you are talking and I appreciate the discussion of how can can the coordinating board staff make our lives easier, and I appreciate that. But it's a culmination of a lot of things, a lot of balls in the air that we have to be dealing with. But anything that you can take off of us, and I guess what I'm doing is pushing for the alignment that we've talked about so extensively this morning and this afternoon. So anyway, that's my anecdotal.
And that piece, I'm a bit of a broken record on this, but I'm going to say it again. The alignment is a statute issue,
right?
And if these things are critical, then it's critical that your institutions reach out to the individuals who can actually change the statute on those. None of these alignment issues is, when you mention them, John didn't, raise his eyebrows and go, well, why would you want that changed? And I've never said, why would you want that changed? These alignment issues aren't anything that we don't understand your concern. But sometimes I'll get emails and different questions that come in, and there's confusion about what the agency can and can't do. The agency can't change statute. We can change administrative code if there's unnecessary obstacles in the administrative code. We can provide guidelines to help clarify pieces. We can try to pull together best practices, and so, that's definitely what we want to do. But when it comes to this alignment piece, based on what I'm hearing, I'm hoping that everyone who's saying this alignment piece is an issue, that you're not just saying it to us, because you've made the point with us.
Right.
We understand, we agree. You need to be making the point to other people than us at this point.
Right.
Taryn, I see your hand.
There was one other area that jumped out to me, and it actually has come up as an issue for us this year just a little bit, but the parent, like the custodial parent issue and Texas residency parent issue. I don't know if other schools have had this, but with COVID, we've had a lot of parents moving around and families moving around, especially with online school and people relocating and online work. So acquiring Texas residency this year has been interesting. And in the FAFSA, the new simplified FAFSA is going to switch from the parent the student lived with during the previous 12 months to the parent that provides student financial support, which I know does not directly conflict with any state, not that I can think of off the top of my head, any state regulations for aid, but it does come up sometimes with the Texas residency core questions and how the parent's relationship to the student on how they qualify for federal aid could sometimes be different than how they qualify for state aid, or at least qualify as a Texas resident. So again, I haven't thought through the whole dynamics of that, but because that's a component that's changing, it did make me think that is something that we may need to keep an eye on as well.
So you could have a student who one parent is being listed on the core residency to claim the residency, validly claim the residency, but it's the other parent that fills out the FAFSA validly because they're the one who provides the most financial support, which could definitely be occurring. I mean, when you've got a divorce situation, you could definitely have the non-custodial, what we call currently the non-custodial parent, really being the one who's contributing more financially, in situations. And so, that's a piece. And actually, as my staff knows, it's not until I talk out loud that some of the synapses fire in my brain. And saying that out loud, a piece that, I've seen information come out that the Department of Ed kind of modeled, the impact of the changes in the SAI, and they one number I saw was that they modeled that less than 4% of students would see more than a $10 reduction in their Pell Grant. So based on their modeling, it wasn't a widespread impact. But I'm realizing there was really no way for them to model how many people are going to lose Pell eligibility because it's now a different parent. So, parents 1 and 2 are divorced. Parent 1 is very low income, supported by, the income from parent 2. But now parent 2, who has a high income, is going to be the one reporting on the FAFSA, and thus the student's going to lose the Pell eligibility. So
and the other piece that I'm not sure how they modeled that's changing, because this is numbers they don't currently have, is the fact that SAI formula will include family farm and small business assets that were previously excluded. Well, if they were excluded, then we wouldn't know what those assets are. So once those assets get added on, you may also have students fall out of Pell eligibility that you didn't account for when you modeled because you didn't know how much those assets were. So I'm curious how the impact of that piece as well. And again, I don't know how that carries over to the state side, but some of our small business owners, especially to do that when we're going to be looking at a FAFSA that will be a tax year that included COVID, which affected small business owners, will be really interesting to see the impact of that.
Mm-hmm.
This is Ed. Just a couple thoughts in all of this. One, back to the selective service registration. I'm wondering, because it was referenced, we can easily access the Social Security Administration to determine if a student has registered for selective service. Would that be something that the state could do as part of the process? And then if or if not, the other would be, what would the onus of responsibility of schools be to the state for that selective service registration? Would it be a self-certification of the student, or would it be the opportunity to confirm through the Selective Service Administration? And I think that's been clarified before, but, again, thinking about what, how could schools be doing that? Or I think more importantly, could the state determine that somehow? Just a thought. The other is...
Can we pause before you jump?
Sure.
Because I'll just admit, Ed, sometimes you wrap too many layers on things and I'm not able to follow them all.
Yeah.
So on that selective service piece, in terms of the administration of it, on that first item, it sounds like you're saying, could we go out and check whether or not people are selective service registered and let you know that they are selective service registered? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I guess that's just, not even knowing how that can be accessed or anything, but
okay.
Again,
so I'm not sure about that, simply because we don't know who your students are, because till after you've really done.
So you don't receive FAFSA information on students?
We receive FAFSA information.
Okay.
But we don't know who you're considering for financial aid.
Yeah. So I guess just, again, not to.
Yeah, because we're not if we were
that,
centralized.
But, if you were able to look at everybody who submitted a FAFSA that through the state, and then somehow, just like I'm assuming the federal government is doing, is they're running that against the Social Security or the Selective Service Administration, would there be a way the state could do that and then check off registered or not,
and then submit
it would
that
be
out
up to school to follow up. So I just again, that may be more complex and there may be limitations on sharing data, but just a thought. Yeah.
And you keep jumping to that made to be more complex, and I'm not able to get in to make sure I'm understanding in the first place. So I'll just leave that one be and let you go on.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not understanding.
Okay. Yeah. So the second, I think, is just a general concept that I think I wonder about because of this whole idea of FAFSA simplification. I think, in essence, what the Department of Ed is doing is they're making it simpler to determine if a student is eligible for a Pell Grant. Mm-hmm. And acknowledging the fact that for many students, just receiving the Pell Grant does not achieve affordability for the student. And, you know, I think admittedly in this whole process, even though it's made it simpler for the student to apply, determine if you get a Pell Grant, is it inadvertently adding more complexity for the student to secure all of the funds that they need in order to be able to access higher education? And so, you know, are there ways that we can eliminate that? Again, talked about consistency, to not then ask the student to have to confirm other things for state eligibility and all that. But I think that's a general theme with the Department of Education at the federal level, and with the FAFSA being just something to see, do you get a Pell Grant or not, and missing the point that there's more to it than that. So I just leave it at that, and then the idea of how do we remove those potential other barriers for those students that are most needy to secure all the funds they need to attend a higher education institution. Because at a public university, a student cannot afford at a four-year public to attend with just a Pell Grant. The state funds are. Yeah.
So as you've described it, a bit of it, I think, I think it's very interesting the way you've described it as the fact that the federal government has really focused in on it being the free application for federal student aid. And, you know, it being a document to determine your eligibility for the federal programs, and kind of taking off all these other layers of things that are related to it. In relation to the other piece that you mentioned, I think the most critical thing will be, you mention about, you know, all the other barriers that are created for the Financial Aid Advisory Committee members to be able to articulate to us. You know, we know the selective service barrier, but being able to articulate to us, these are what the other barriers are, so that we can understand, is there anything at the state level that, you know, we can contribute to assist with that. You know, some of those barriers may be have to do with your own institutional aid or things like that. And that's, you know, your institutional decisions. We shouldn't be intruding on, those pieces of it. But if there's barriers that you're seeing, you know, that are being created by the FAFSA Simplification Act when it comes to state financial aid, absolutely articulate those barriers to us so that we can understand them and try to address them. Victoria, I saw your hand up.
I'd like to add on to Ed's comment regarding the simplification of the FAFSA and the allocation of institutional aid from a private school perspective. I wonder if that will push more schools to institute additional application process outside of just the FAFSA and perhaps the TASFA, and the variations of applications that will further create barriers for students. For the most part, when we implement, for example, the CSS profile, it's really to catch families with income and resources that are not apparent on the FAFSA, but inadvertently, that creates some barriers for low-income students. And so it would be interesting just to see how other schools will progress with that simplification process.
Other thoughts, or really not other thoughts, other specific items that you're concerned about how your institutions are going to be able to are going to be impacted by the FAFSA Simplification Act. I have, just so you all know, I get a delay on seeing your hand. So if any of you raised your hand, I don't see it on my end. So until like 2 minutes after you raised it. Okay. Well, thank you for all of this information. I appreciate it. And we'll keep at, if you have one of those moments of, you're eating dinner tonight and all of a sudden you think, oh, that's the thing I should have shared. Don't hesitate to send me an email so that SFAP can really be thinking about, what are the implications to your institutional aid offices so that we can be trying to figure out, are there things that we can do within the current environment? Are there things that we need to be raising to the attention of our leaderships and external relations area? And, just, if we don't get something fixed this session, it doesn't mean we don't try to get it fixed in the future. Yes, the next session would be a bit of a miss because one academic year will have started already under the new FAFSA Simplification Act. But my guess is that you all would rather have us still try to get it fixed rather than say, oh, well, it already went into place, so never mind, we won't worry about it anymore. So unless I hear otherwise from you, I'm going to keep focused on these concepts. So I think then the last item is just an update from the financial aid office here. It's been a very slow past 3 months in terms of rules. As opposed to the 6 months prior, we've only had one rule that went through, and it just amended a definition in the general provisions, which was a definition that you all had guided me on. And we haven't proposed any new rules lately for the Texas Register. And in the handout, some of the dates for the when memos were going to be released aren't quite right because we had a little winter storm in the midst and kind of pushed off all the dates and things like that. We had originally hoped to send out all the information about the net price calculator change last week. But then due to the winter storm, we weren't able to finish up our testing. We were supposed to finish up our testing during that week of the winter storm. And so that did delay the rollout of the net price calculator. But that information is headed out. And I hope that people will join in on the webinar on March 9th that will go over that information. And for those who are listening to this presentation online, just reemphasizing something that Deshay mentioned is that once we bring up the new net price calculator next week, we will go live as institutions send us their information. So we're not going to wait for everybody to submit it and then just put it all up there. Your information will be out there as quickly as you submit it to us. So if you want your information out there fast, get it to us fast and we'll get it up there. So also, I did want to emphasize one of the memos that was sent out early in February, and that had to do with summer work study. In the past, summer work study was limited solely to institutions who received reallocated funds, and they could use those reallocated funds for summer work study. We read through the administrative code to see exactly how things were written, and realized that the administrative code gave us some leeway to provide institutions, as long as we provided specific permission to institutions, that they could use their allocation through the summer as well. And so checked with our general counsel, and they agreed that I could give blanket permission to all institutions. And so we did revise things so that institutions did not have to return money in February if they had unencumbered work-study funds, and that they have permission to use those funds through the rest of the year. And they just have to return unused funds by the end of August. So I hope that that additional flexibility is helpful. I know that Texas Work Study isn't the biggest of programs, but we want to try to do everything we can to provide flexibility for institutions. So I wanted to mention that in case in the midst of all the email that you get, that one somehow slipped through. Just a reminder about a couple deadlines coming up. The opt-in, opt-out surveys for whether you want to participate in the Educational Aid Program, the Texas College Work Study Program, or the Work Study Student Mentorship Program. Those are all due by March 12th. So if you want to participate, be sure to submit your form. Failure to receive a form, we interpret as you're opting out of the program. And then for those of you who submit good neighbor recommendations for that exemption program, those are due by March 15th. So make sure you get those in. It was mentioned earlier about those delinquency files are available to you. Some of you may be interested in the Texas Armed Services Scholarship Program. That nomination process is slated to start April 15th, is when we will open that up for elected officials to be able to submit their nominations for the program. So that is currently set. And we did also, just for your knowledge, send out over 40,000 IRS tax statements in February, or actually end of January. And so we're dealing with all of the questions related to that. One final piece that I wanted to mention was that I am very pleased to announce that effective March 1st, Deshae Reed has been promoted to Senior Director of Financial Aid Services. Since arriving in March 2015, she got here literally 1 week before I got here. She took a job as Director of Grants and Special Programs, and has demonstrated immense flexibility as I redesigned the Office of Student Financial Aid Programs. And she has led her area through significant changes, including taking on the Texas Financial Aid Information Center toll-free hotline, loan origination activities, administration of the TASK program, most recently the loan repayment programs that we administer, joined her team with the retirement of Lisa Moeller. And so she has really expanded her area to create the financial aid services department that we have today. And one of the things, based on her new role as senior director, the THECB representative position on the FAC will actually transition from me to Deshae beginning with the September meeting. My time on the FAC has been instrumental in helping me understand Texas financial aid. Many of you know that while I had worked in financial aid for almost 24 years before coming to the agency. All my experience was in the Northeast. And so I understood aid, but I didn't understand Texas aid. And you all helped me understand Texas aid, and I'm incredibly grateful for all the support that you provided me. Despite having come from New York, you allowed that little piece to go to the side and still let me come in and do this. I look forward to finding new ways to interact with financial aid professionals because I think it's important for me to have that interaction as I continue to grow in my role as assistant commissioner. But this is a great opportunity to recognize the work that Deshay has done during her 6 years at the agency. And I'm so pleased to be able to promote her to senior director and to have her join you on the Financial Aid Advisory Committee.
Congratulations, Deshay.
Thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to stepping into the role of being the representative for the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. A lot of you have worked with me on the subcommittee, so this will definitely be nice to work with the full committee as well. So thank you, and thank you all for your support as well.
Having said that, unless there's any questions about really any of the past, hour that I've been doing this, agenda items in this meeting, I'll turn it back over to Ed.
All right. So really the last item here is just opportunity to discuss any future topics that we might want to add to our agenda for the next meeting. I think in that area, not only are there topics that we'd like to discuss, I think the other thing that I would throw out there, because I know in working with Chad and now we'll be working with Deshay, looking for opportunities if there's information or topics where it might be beneficial to this committee to hear about. We want to build that into these meetings. So if you're aware of a particular area, a particular speaker who brings insight and perspective that would assist with not only state financial aid, but the broader financial aid, let us know, let Chad or myself know, and see how we might be able to build that into future meetings. But are there any topics or issues that you'd like to specifically be added to this next meeting or future meetings? All right, then we'll just mention that we will meet again on June 3rd. The format and location of that meeting is to be determined. So hang on to that. I mean, yeah, can't pull out our crystal ball, but we will be meeting on the 3rd in one form or another. And sounds like that will be the last meeting that Chad will be helping to coordinate. And I think if I understand correctly, Deshay will be kind of jointly working on that meeting and then, working on the handoff for the meeting. But, looking forward to that transition. And I want to recognize Deshay and again, the excitement of seeing her step into this new role and her work with this committee. I think we're not going to miss a step there. And with Chad, with the direct involvement that you've had with this committee, much appreciative. And again, however that will transition in ways that continue to be engaged, I think will be valuable to not only the coordinating board and you, but I think to all the members of this committee, as well as members of the financial aid community here in the state of Texas. So at this point, just asking, is there any additional items of discussion? If not, we'll call for adjourning of this meeting. So last opportunity for any comment statements. Hearing none, this meeting is adjourned. And again, look forward to connecting with all of you again back on June 3rd. Thank you.